a red flag flying here.
Hello and welcome to Socialist Think Tank. Today we're here with Joe Guinan. Hello, Joe.
Hi, Paul. Great to be with you.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant that you're here. We're really grateful for you joining us. So I'm going to go into the first question, which is, what is socialism to you?
Thanks, Paul. That's a huge question. In many ways, socialism, I would say, is my life. It's been my personal life. It's been my own sort of political commitment. It's been what I do, because I'm very fortunate to be able to work to advance socialism. And I'm no doubt we're going to dig in a little bit on my work later. But really, for me, socialism is about human possibility. It's about personal growth and development and transformation in solidarity and community with others. It's about us as human beings realizing our full potential and the potential of each other hand in hand, in solidarity, collectively, in community, within environmental boundaries. And you know, socialism is a mode of being as well as a sort of destination and an endpoint. I could give you definitions about socialism as a political economic system, but it's also for me a set of values and a way of living and a way of orienting yourself towards other people that I've sort of grown up with and has always really been part of who I am. I'm what the Americans call a red diaper baby. I grew up in a household of Reds. My parents actually met on a committee to help liberate some people that had been arrested in a protest against the far right in the 1970s in my hometown of Blackburn. My dad at that point was in the Communist Party, my mother in the Labour Party, and so they were brought together in sort of anti-fascist direct action. And so growing up, I always lived in this sort of milieu of politics, of trade unionists, of Irish Republicans, of revolutionaries actually from around the world, people that would come and stay. I remember people from Ethiopia, people from the ANC. We even had Soviet diplomats stay with us on a number of occasions, which was really interesting, watching the changing apparatchiks pre and post Gorbachev and so on. So for me, socialism is my family business. I've inherited a lot of politics, but I also think I've spent a lot of time thinking and working out for myself where socialism needs to go in the 21st century. A couple of little stories for you. The legend in my family is that my very first political observation was in a car in Northern Ireland, where we were over visiting family. My dad was a Catholic who grew up in Warrenpoint and Newry. And apparently we were sort of pulling up to a checkpoint with British soldiers sort of pointing their rifles around. And legend has it that I said to my mum and my dad, the enemies of these soldiers are the ordinary people, aren't they? So that was my insight into the role of the state and of imperialism. Another sort of story is really about morality. I grew up in a working class family. My mother was the first person on either side of the family to have gone to university ever. My dad left school at 14 and did a number of jobs, some of them political jobs, but also manual jobs and other things. But we did all right. My mother became a professional. She was a psychologist in the National Health Service. And so we had enough to get by on. And I remember this sort of excruciating embarrassment of having to go into school whenever there was a school trip and have to explain to the teacher that here was my money for me to go on the school trip, but I could only go if I also brought some money to pay for someone else who couldn't afford to go. And to me, it was a really embarrassing thing to have to do as a little child, but it actually, I think, really opened my eyes from a very early stage to inequality, to people less fortunate than myself, and to a commitment to being in solidarity with others. So socialism has always played a big role in my life, and it always will.
That's quite a backstory. That's really impressive and incredibly interesting. I'm not quite sure where to go on that one because there's so much to go into. I'm going to talk a little bit about the visitors you had. Look, so how when you're having people visiting your home and and completely different cultures from your own, but with that shared thread of socialism, I imagine. What was that like? What sort of things did you learn from people who were just passing through?
I mean, I was a right little nerd of a child, right? What I really wanted was to sit at the table with the adults and to listen to them and to learn from the conversations that were going on and absorb that. So even when I was sent to bed, I'd sometimes like sneak out of bed and sit on the stairs and listen to the conversations that were still taking place downstairs. And it was, yeah, it was people from all walks of life, people from around the UK, obviously trade unionists, Labour Party politicians, and people from other left-wing organisations. But then there was also that international dimension, which was always hugely important to my dad. Right, he'd left Northern Ireland in search of employment, like so many before him, and ended up in the Fleet Air Arm and fought in the Korean War, as he put it, killing communists, and then came back and joined the party and was a full-time organizer for them for a while. And so through those connections, but also through the Labour Party and the Benite left and others, we'd have some really interesting visitors. I do remember the Ethiopians in particular. I've still got a book that one of them gave to my dad on the Ethiopian Revolution. And then the South Africans, who were obviously traipsing the world, building up solidarity and political action against apartheid. And as the bombs rain down on Gaza today, that sort of the power of those solidarity networks and the importance of boycotts, the importance of sanctions, the importance of divestment sort of comes back to me. But yeah, it was something that I think I was very fortunate to be exposed to. We didn't have a lot of money, we didn't have a lot of privilege, we did all right, but there was a tremendous atmosphere of learning and of possibility and of seeing and understanding the sort of the struggles that were taking place all around the world and being part of them. With that international dimension was always there. My elder half brother's middle name is Ernesto, and mine's Camilo. You were remarking on the mug. Well, there he is. So again, very embarrassing to grow up with as a child, but an important part now of who I am. And so, yeah, that culture of politics, of discussion, of debate is a tremendous gift. I think it's one of the better educations I think it would have been possible to receive in politics, hearing from these people, seeing their struggles, understanding what was going on all around the world from an early age.
And it's remarkable that you've had those experiences. Now we don't usually these interviews we don't usually speak about current events, but with Gaza and everything, and with it being such a long-standing thing of the siege has been going on for years and years, and I guess it's likely to continue on for years to come. So it is a consistent thing. How does it feel like? So you spoke about South Africa earlier on, and there are certain things that are accepted as true. And I'm sure during what the black people in South Africa were experiencing was accepted as being okay. It was accepted as being the norm. And then, you go through that, and then, what's it like to kind of see people come around to your way of thinking? How, I suppose South Africa is the biggest thing in our lifetime, I imagine, to change. So what's it like seeing, like, you can see the correct way, you can see that you've learned about this correct way, and then all of a sudden you see it's changed, and everyone else comes around to your way of thinking. Even, Thatcher was praising Mandela by the end, after calling him a terrorist for years. And, David Cameron was allegedly in a group that wanted to hang him. And then, then he's like, goes to his funeral, so what's that like?
It's interesting, right? Growing up, I grew up at sort of the high point of neoliberalism, right? In many ways, where the Berlin Wall had fallen, the communist bloc had dissolved. It was the end of history. We were told that socialism was impossible and that capitalism was here to stay, and yet South Africa was the sort of counterpoint to that, right? It was the story of the sort of us getting it right, of being on the right side of history, and how that sort of came around. And so, but then I actually was fortunate enough to be able to go to South Africa. I spent quite a bit of time in Johannesburg, and got out to Soweto, and did the tours, and saw all of that. And it was quite sobering, really. And in many ways, it sort of reminded me of Northern Ireland in the sort of post-conflict period, in sort of following the Good Friday Peace Agreement, where what you saw was a community that had been extremely politicized and mobilized, and then in a way they'd won, and suddenly going through the shanty towns of Soweto, there were people had big screen TVs and cars, and there was some affluence and prosperity for some of them that was beginning. But there was also a sort of funny sense of emptiness, that the struggle had ended, but that it wasn't clear where to go next. And that really reminded me a lot of Northern Ireland, and of the sort of the end of the sort of pressure cooker there. But on your larger point, I mean, obviously the victory over apartheid has been a hugely important one in world historical terms, but it's also been a very partial one. And I think there are a lot of sobering reflections for the left in terms of the way that the ANC has governed and the shortcomings and limitations of that. So if I may, I'll just read you, I think, a quote that pertains to this, which is from The Dream of John Ball by William Morris, who wrote, quote, "I pondered all these things and how men fight and lose the battle, and the thing that they fought for comes about in spite of their defeat. And when it comes, turns out not to be what they meant, and other men have to fight for what they meant under another name." And I think that's sort of a little bit the sort of story of the left in history. Often there's no final victory, no final defeat, obviously only sort of endless struggle and commitment. But it's the comrades that we make along the way, and the victories and the accomplishments that we achieve that keep us getting out of bed in the morning. So I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Yeah, it does. It does, and it also like leads me to the next thing I'd like to really like discuss it. Um, do you think we like once we? I don't think we know how to win very well on the left. I don't think socialists know how to win very well and take that battle forward, because the struggle's been so hard, and it's almost like, well, what do we do now? But every time we seem to accommodate the status quo, we seem to accommodate like these neoliberal values and seem to have to fit in with that. Is that something you'd agree with? That you've seen?
Yeah, I think learning how to win is something we're going to have to do really fast, right? Because one thing that we're up against now that we haven't been in sort of earlier phases of history, I suppose there was always the bomb, the shadow of the bomb and of sort of nuclear annihilation that was threatening. But now we've got the sort of slow bomb of climate change, which places real hard limits on and a time frame and a clock on us, and so really figuring out how to hold steady and to win and to get really hard-nosed and strategic about the task ahead of us, the time that we've got to do it in, what's worth doing and what's not, how to avoid getting distracted, is going to be really, really important in the next phase, especially coming out of this sort of latest round, this latest cycle. I think of it as sort of Corbyn Sanders, really, where in those two political economies, the United States, the United Kingdom, two of the advanced industrial countries that were the first to go deep into neoliberalism, and where the rot has really gone the deepest in many ways. And that was where we got this attempt suddenly, after what seemed like a long period of time in which left was fractured and divided and horizontalist and wasn't really a contender for state power, suddenly there emerged this possibility that in parallel, in some ways, we might actually have a shot. And of course, we lost on both counts. But I think we lost. It's like the fail better thing. We've lost to the point where we're actually considerably advanced over where we were, prior to those efforts. But there's also important lessons to be learned. There are no shortcuts. You can't just leapfrog over the problem of movement building and of political education and the hard slog of really bringing people along. There was this sort of moonshot that we got on both sides that was worth taking. It was worth a shot. It was worth a chance. And yet, it didn't succeed. And the reasons why it didn't succeed, both internal to our movement and what we need to learn about that, but also in terms of the forces of opposition that we're facing, we're really going to have to get our minds around that and get really laser focused, I think, in the next phase of struggle, because there ain't much time. There's a quote I like to use from D. Ward Huck, which is that it's far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism. And I think that's the sort of abiding spirit that I try to do my work in and operate from. But it's true. We probably got 2 electoral cycles, if you want to think about it in electoral terms, to really bend the arc on climate emissions. And we certainly need to be doing things now that begin processes of change and transformation and education and movement building that will pay off maybe in a decade from now. But we need to start taking that horizon, I think, and really working seriously and soberly and strategically towards that.
That's an excellent way of moving into our next section. Now, sometimes on the left and socialist, we're accused of basically being a token shop. A lot of people with, who just talk about things and don't really do anything and don't really like firm out the ideas and what have you. And it's funny, on Socialist Think Tank, we've been accused of this by people who haven't watched the show, funnily enough, because our show is actually quite a lot about action and what we can do now and how we can come together. But a lot of the time on our Facebook posts, they're like, "Oh, what a great idea! Another left-wing token shop," sarcastically. Now, you are quite involved in actually doing something and actually building something, aren't you? So is the vice president of the Democracy Collaborative.
That's
so can you
right.
tell me a little bit about the Democracy Collaborative?
Absolutely, Paul. Be glad to. So the Democracy Collaborative is a US based think do tank, as we call it. On the one hand, we're working on policy and the sort of theory of change of the move towards what we call a democratic economy. Economic democracy is another way of thinking about this. The actual transformation of the core institutions of the economy so that they can, in and of themselves, deliver the kinds of outcomes we're looking for in terms of greater equality, of environmental sustainability, of community stability, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, we work on the ground. We're known for the approach that is getting more and more airtime at the moment, which is community wealth building, which is really a model of how to go about rebuilding, rewiring the local economy from the ground up, using the purchasing power of public institutions, of nonprofit institutions, large place-based economic entities that aren't going to pick up and move like private corporations. So, your local council or your university or your healthcare system or whatever, and really using all of that, which amounts, roughly speaking, if you look around the UK, to about sort of 30% of the local economy, that we're just not actually using in the way that we could. It's democratically accountable. It's sort of repurposable for our ends if we know how to go about doing it. And so, starting in Cleveland, Ohio, where we built the Evergreen co-ops, and now being taken up in more and more places around the world, including Preston, just down the road from where I grew up, but also more and more places around the UK. This model and this approach is a way of moving forward, even when you don't have national economic power to really start to build a new democratic socialist economy from the ground up. But it's got a really interesting backstory. So I don't know if we've got time here, but if you like, I could tell you a little bit about the origins of these ideas, because I think they're a pretty interesting story. So the
Please do,
democracy,
yeah.
yeah,
Sorry.
great. Oh, absolutely. So the Democracy Collaborative is sort of a successor organization to a series of entities that go all the way back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in the 1960s and 70s, and really we've been developing this. I suppose before Blair and Clinton, you might have called it the third way, which is not the third way that we've come to know of, but really a sort of a community-based, sort of pluralist approach to building a socialist economy that isn't just state ownership and control in the sort of Eastern Bloc model, and certainly isn't corporate capitalism, but really is about economic democracy and democratizing ownership through worker-owned cooperatives or through public enterprise, but democratic and accountable, or through land trusts or community and public banking, and on and on and on. But there's been a sort of interesting prehistory to this, and I'm actually doing a little work on this at the moment in the form of a political biography of our co-founder Gar Alpovitz, who I like to describe as being essentially the Forrest Gump of the American left. If something important was happening in post-war America on the left, you know, more often than not, he was there and often at the center of it. So just to give you a little sketch of like our origins in terms of his life story and how these ideas came about. He was born in Wisconsin under the shadow of McCarthy, and like hooked himself up with the politicians of the day that were actually advancing a progressive agenda. So he was at the University of Wisconsin and was taught by a guy called William Appleman Williams, who was one of the new left historians who really sort of started to open up a new kind of historiography of the left. And then from there, he went to the West Coast and studied under Paul Barron, the Marxist economist who was at Stanford at the time. And then from there, he decided he wanted to do his PhD in the UK and came to London, to the LSE, which he thought was this great left-wing hub of energy and ideas, because he'd heard about Harold Lasky and people like that. But when he got there, he found it was just a sort of liberal dead end. So he got on the train to Cambridge and he met Joan Robinson, who was who should have been the first woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Economics, a really interesting left Keynesian who's also written a lot about Marxist economics, and Joan Robinson and so on. And so Joan Robinson became his PhD supervisor, and then he started. He was originally looking at the issue of American power and the sort of projection of power and corporations' needs to expand into foreign markets and what that did to U.S. foreign policy. But he ended up stumbling upon all the conversations that were going on around the Potsdam Conference, and ended up writing as his PhD the sort of first revisionist account of the decisions that led to the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which he argued, and this was the first revisionist account of that, was really the sort of opening battle of the Cold War. And rather than necessary to concluding the Second World War. And you got a lot of pushback on that, as you can imagine, for trying to argue that actually we didn't need to bomb Japan. What we did it for was essentially to get in there before the Soviets could arrive. But in the course, he'd written this PhD, and he was finishing it. But he went back to Washington D.C. to John Kennedy's Washington, and was there working on the Hill and in the Library of Congress, and saw up close the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on. But then ended up doing quite a bit of work on Capitol Hill, and connected up with the Civil Rights Movement, and became friends with people like Martin Luther King, actually, and they needed an economic agenda. And so he was like how to build community self-determination and reliance, and how to provide sort of an economic plan for communities to be able to stand on their own feet in the face of the opposition of the state. And so he was very involved in early attempts to design a kind of community-based economics that led to things like the Community Development Corporation in the United States. He also, while he was there, worked for Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, who was the founder of Earth Day. In the process, he helped give Ralph Nader his first job in actually pushing a sort of agenda of consumer protection, even before the unsafe at any speed work that Nader did on the automotive industry, and so on. And so it was just a really interesting time. He ended up being there on the Hill for that period after Johnson beat Goldwater, and there was a landslide, and you could move all sorts of progressive legislation. But he was also part of trying to seat the Mississippi Freedom Delegation at the Democratic Party National Convention, and so on. Then he found his way into the State Department for a while, and was on the Vietnam desk, which is really interesting, and then quit over the direction of US policy under Lyndon Johnson, and moved up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he met people like Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and many of the names that will be familiar to your listeners, and was part of a sort of new left current up there. And while he was there, he was at a dinner party, and this guy came up to him that, you know, that was also a guest, and introduced himself. And it was this former researcher at the Rand Corporation who'd left and was visiting Harvard, by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel Ellsberg had in his briefcase basically had the Pentagon Papers that he'd smuggled out of Rand. And so the next day, Gar got a call from someone else who'd been there saying, "Oh, you know, can you help us out? We've got this issue, this problem. There's about to be an FBI manhunt for Daniel Ellsberg, and we need to get these papers out." And so Gar just basically said, "Yeah, I can help." And so provided his apartment for Daniel Ellsberg to hide in when the Nixon administration launched a nationwide FBI manhunt for him, and then pioneered the way of getting the papers out, because the New York Times had published them and had been shut down by the courts, and they were trying to get them out in the Washington Post, but the same thing was about to happen. There was a movie about this just a few years ago called The Post, which you may have seen, which is a good account of some of this stuff. But what wasn't known was that in the background was Gar, and Gar took this code name. He called himself Mr. Boston, which wasn't a very advanced code name, but it held up for many, many years. It was only 2013 that his role actually finally came out, because what he would do was call up journalists from newspapers around the country and have them fly into Logan Airport in Boston, and essentially be told to go and check into a motel, into a particular room, and wait for the phone to ring. And the phone would ring, and it'd be like, "Look outside your door." And outside the door would be an envelope with a chunk of the Pentagon Papers in them. And so this was how the word was got out on really what the United States had been doing in Vietnam, and all the wrong decisions that had been made, and all the lies that had been told to the American public, and so on. So Gar played this role, which he could have gone to, you know, federal prison for life if they'd known that it was him. And he kept this secret until I think it was until just a couple of years ago, when the Trump administration was threatening whistleblowers and so on, and he decided he needed to tell this story in public. And so the New Yorker broke the story and so on. But then anyway, it was a really interesting time when he was up there. Andre Gortz and people like that would come over, and so there was like a lot of a really interesting thinking about how to develop a new sort of economics beyond traditional state socialism and corporate capitalism. He ended up playing a big role in deindustrialization and the fight to save the steel mills, which is a kind of direct sort of predecessor to community wealth building, the way that we do it. He was in, you know, he went to Tanzania and saw what was going on in Nyeri and Ujima. And so there's all that kind of sort of third world socialist current coming into some of this economics as well. So it's a really interesting organization with this really interesting backstory that has really touched on sort of many of the really important, you know, crossroads and decision points of. So I first met him shortly after 2000, and did a kind of a tour of duty as his research assistant there, and helped him on his book America Beyond Capitalism. And then I've went off and did some other things, but I've been back at the Democracy Collaborative since 2012, and we've really been pushing ahead on things like Corbynomics when the opportunity arose to really help them build out that agenda. And certainly now we're working, very aggressively with the left in the United States around the openings that there are, because there are some around the Biden administration, and being able to push, some of the sort of cutting edge ideas of how to go about economic reconstruction from COVID. So that's a long and meandering story, but that's sort of like where these ideas come from. And so when you hear about Preston and you hear about Cleveland and you hear about the increasing number of places that are doing this stuff, there's a lot of history that has gone into sort of figuring out these strategies and approaches. And I feel like very privileged to be in the position to be able to kind of help advance these ideas into their next phase.
I see what you mean about the Forrest Gump thing. It's it's an incredible story. So community wealth building as well. So that I think a lot of people have the idea that socialists all believe that actually the state should control everything, and people shouldn't necessarily have a say in that. And that's all they see in socialism. They see that kind of. A lot of people describe what was going on in Soviet Russia as state capitalism, actually, don't they? But that's not what you're describing here, is it? It's almost the opposite.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we'd all be able to agree on is that the ownership and control of capital is at the center of any political economic system, and it always has been throughout human history. So you go back to the ancient world, and essentially these were slave modes of production that produced the pyramids and so forth. Under feudalism, it was the landowning aristocracy, the feudal barons, and then obviously under capitalism, it's capitalists who own the means of production, and then under state socialism, as you described, the state was the principal locus of economic power. What we're arguing is that we need collective public democratic forms of ownership over the means of production, but that those can take plural forms. It can be worker co-ops, it can be the commons, it can be local decentralized public ownership, municipal enterprise, ownership at the local and regional level. And in some instances, you want to see national public ownership outright. And there are certainly cases where in a sense, it's the old principle of subsidiarity, right? You do things as low and as at the lowest possible scale, but sometimes the lowest possible scale is the national scale. So if you want an integrated energy grid, you probably want a national grid, but that doesn't mean that all energy has to be produced by one big public corporation. It can be produced locally by community ownership, by localities owning wind farms, or whatever the new green energy source might be. So yeah, absolutely. It's a very I think adaptable and flexible approach that really says there's a sort of sliding scale of ownership. There can be some small scale private ownership in our view of things that don't really matter, and that as long as there's living wages and regulatory protections and the environment is being looked after, that's actually a source of innovation in an economy. But more often than not, you might want to look to workers to work cooperatively in owning businesses, or certainly once you get to a certain scale of enterprise, you actually then need to move to public ownership, because otherwise you've got these unaccountable sort of over empowered sort of economic actors, which we see like the super corporations in the world today. So yeah, it's a plural sort of approach to how to own and control capital, but it's still a democratic, and I would argue still a socialist approach to thinking about those things. It's just about what scale is the public that you're talking about. Maybe it's the scale of the workers in a firm, maybe it's the scale of the community, the city, maybe it's the scale of the region, or maybe it's national public ownership, depending on the sector, depending on the industry.
So I think the important thing really is here, how do we go about that? How do we do this?
So this is where it's quite encouraging, actually. And I know it's often a bit bleak to be on the left, certainly in the UK at the moment. But what we actually have been observing for decades is the sort of steady sort of unrolling of experimentation in communities all around the UK, around the US, but all around the world, really, where as sort of a dying neoliberalism decays and as the sort of social pain and the sort of limits of what it's possible to do under that model in terms of deliver for people really gets felt, people are turning more and more to experimentation. And it's actually getting to a pretty interesting scale. Most people don't realize, but 1 in 3 Americans is a member of a co-op of one form or another, whether that's an agricultural co-op or a credit union, a one member, one vote cooperative bank, essentially. And so, if you take that, or you take the fact that more American workers at the moment are part owners or full owners of their own enterprises than are members of unions in the private sector. American sort of union density has been nosediving, right? It's down to 6% now in the private sector, 11% overall when you take the public sector into account. And yet there's this sort of counter trend where we're actually seeing, employee ownership sort of, above 10 million workers now. Doesn't always mean that they don't behave like capitalists, doesn't always mean that those businesses are ethical businesses, etc. But it's a way of sort of getting into to the political economy and doing things a little differently. Another example: a quarter of America's electricity is produced by either publicly owned at the local level or cooperative sort of power. And that's really getting to scale. There's some really interesting models like state ownership of capital in the forms of sovereign wealth funds. In Alaska, for example, it's all dirty energy originated, but the Alaska Permanent Fund has been created that really was about the selling of the leases for drilling and for oil extraction and so on. And what that's held in is a trust, which then actually pays out a dividend to every eligible man, woman, and child in Alaska that actually reaches something like, at the peak, that dividend has been $2,000 a year, which is an interesting top up to, and it sort of gets you on the path almost to universal basic income. Or there are other places like Alabama or Texas, like Republican conservative parts of the United States, where, retirement systems of Alabama operates like a sovereign wealth fund that essentially owns businesses and takes the returns and directs them to paying for public services. The Texas fund essentially means that they don't need to have a state income tax to pay for education because, again, they're using the returns from capital to directly produce public services. A lot of these models are flawed, and we wouldn't recognize them as socialist on the face of it, but they contain within themselves the sort of the seed of the idea of how to go about rewiring and reshaping the economy. And I guess the essential thing is that what we're not doing here is taxing and spending and redistributing, although I'm all in favor of higher taxes on the wealthy, including wealth taxes. I'm all in favor of redistributive spending, but we actually need to be much more ambitious than that, because the problem with tax and spend is that you're letting the economy function the way that it functions, and then you're trying to clean up around the edges afterwards, after the fact. And what we're talking about is actually changing the way that the economy fundamentally operates so that it delivers for us the kinds of outcomes we're looking to secure in and of themselves. So it's happening, it's sort of evolving, it's, it breaks out here and there, and sometimes it gets blocked or rolled back, but there's a sort of emerging democratic economy that is being proven by real world experiments, by real world action in communities, and we can sort of knit all that together and build upon that, and that becomes the basis, I think, for a new economics. And we sort of saw some of this starting to inform the program that we had under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and the Labour Party.
So this is going on in the UK as well, isn't it? At this time, it's Preston, for example, and it seems to be, to me, it captures the imagination of more than people who say that they're socialist. So personally, I actually think there's more people with socialist values than identify as being socialist. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this channel. But so like, what's going on in Preston, and do you find as well yourself that it is capturing the imagination of people who don't identify with socialism?
Yeah, sure. So Preston's become a little bit of a flagship, although, I would argue there's lots of other places around the UK that are also engaged in community wealth building. But the great story of Preston is that it really comes out of the sort of great financial crisis and the crash of the economy and the end of sort of a model of economic development that really looked for inward investment, for corporations to come and save us, for capitalists to come and put their money in terms of an investment, which was really going to be a regeneration of Preston city centre. Preston's a post-industrial, city that had sort of its ups and downs, certainly since the 50s, in terms of the impacts of trade liberalization, of changes in market economy, of the ups and downs of manufacturing and so on. And so they'd been really buffeted by a lot of that. And then they were hoping that there was going to be this big sort of traditional neoliberal development of the city center, and it fell through. And it fell through in the context of the the economic situation after the crash, but also of kind of shrinking budget envelopes for Preston, as transfers from central government to local councils have been going steadily downwards. And so they really had to do something for themselves and do it with less money. And so what they were looking around for inspiration, and that was when they hit upon the model that we'd really developed of the evergreen cooperatives in Cleveland. And what that was a situation very similar to Preston. Cleveland used to be this enormous sort of industrial and manufacturing hub. At one point, 50 of the 100 millionaires in the United States lived there. It was the Rockefellers, it was Standard Oil, it was a proud industrial city. And then it really, basically, the bottom fell out of it. All the big Fortune 500 companies left. A lot of the population left. 40% of the population went down. Cleveland was second only really to Detroit in terms of the disinvestment and the deindustrialization and the sort of collapse of the municipal economy there. And yet, if you looked around, there were still these big, what we call anchor institutions, hospitals, universities, the city government. If you added it all together, there was all this purchasing power, all this economic power that could have been redirected in terms of rebuilding the economy, but was largely leaking out. And so what we did was create a network of worker co-ops that were owned by their own workers, but that the community held a golden share in, so that they couldn't up and leave. And the idea was to provide goods and services to these big institutions, the government, the university, the hospital, that would in a way begin to allow you to start planning the reconstruction of the economy. And so Preston saw what we'd done there, and they took that model and they really redirected their procurement. They were spending very little of their public budgets within their own jurisdiction in Preston or within Lancashire. A lot of it was going to multinationals and leaking offshore straight away. Instead, they've localized their procurement. They've begun to build democratic enterprises. They've redirected the pension funds. They've really begun to sort of figure out how to build an economy in which wealth recirculates rather than leaks out. And so, yeah, the Preston model, I think, is deservedly really being held up. And what we just saw is the electoral payoffs of that, where when, in the last local elections, Labour lost 300 councillors or more across the country, but in Preston, they held every single seat. And though, similarly in other places that have been pursuing this agenda, there's a sort of electoral payoff, even though that's not why we're doing it. These things are popular. People see that if you've got local socialist leadership actually trying to do practical things that make a difference, then they're prepared to vote for it and stand for it. And this goes, I think, to your original point, which is that, we can talk about these things as transformative socialist economics. We can also talk about them as really pragmatic, practical common sense. If the public sector is spending money, why don't we try and meet other public sector goals in terms of a healthier community, a more equal community, a community that's really utilizing all the investment that we've already put into the infrastructure there, rather than leaving, buildings half empty and roads underutilized and so on. And so there's a different way of thinking about efficiency, a different way of thinking about the payoff. And you can make these arguments in some instances to business people who've got civic pride in their own community, or people that are motivated by religious belief, or environmentalists and so on. And so you can begin to build a coalition that's much bigger, I think, than self-identified socialists. Although I do think you're right. I think often what you're appealing to is a sense of shared values that we haven't always connected to and articulated. And you see it in the opinion polls whenever you poll this sort of agenda. You look at Hartlepool. The Corbyn policies were popular. We just didn't run on them, right? And we haven't done a good job of explaining how they would be delivered and why people's lives would be better if that was the direction that we took.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when people hear about things like the money going offshore and that agenda, that neoliberal kind of agenda where that this money goes to big corporations, that doesn't make sense to anyone. That doesn't fit in with people's belief systems. Is this something that we need to articulate really, really well? As like this isn't about individuals. This is about collective. This is about everyone benefiting.
Absolutely. And I think this is where what you're doing with Socialist Think Tank is so important. I think there's a huge job of political education that needs to be done. For me, the sort of Corbyn experiment has a lot of lessons. There's a lot of lessons around Brexit, for example, that we could go into if we're going in a different direction. But there's also something that's really clear, which is that, we had this opportunity because the leadership of the party fell into our lap to develop this radical policy program. And yet it was done in a way that people didn't fully understand or participate or own and really get their arms around what it was that was being proposed. So there was a sort of gap that opened up between the real needs that people and communities have and in many ways want and are expressing that in opinion polls, and what we were saying and failing to say in terms of communicating the agenda that we developed. And so what I think needs to really happen now is some deep sort of conversations in place around the country, in communities, through trade unions, through socialist organizing, through an alternative media, to really begin to educate people and to expose people to these ideas so that they can understand them themselves and then get involved in the further development of them. I think part of the success of neoliberalism was a kind of mystification of the economy as this thing over there that is difficult to understand and that only the experts and the technocrats can manage. But actually, it really comes down to real common sense things that you can talk about in the pub with your mates and really get people to understand. And yet we haven't done that as a movement. We haven't spent enough time on that. So I absolutely salute all the work that you're doing. And I think that sort of there's no shortcut. As I said earlier, and that we really do have to do that hard work of political education. But the good news is we got the models, we've got the answers, or some of them, and we certainly know where to look for the others. And I don't suppose it's good news, but the fact is that the crises are only going to intensify, and so our answers are only going to become more and more relevant as we move forward. And that's the sort of horizon of the future and what's at stake and what we've got to play for.
It's interesting that you mentioned Hartlepool there, is because Hartlepool was very much linked with the Fabian Society, and at one point the Fabian Society put on something in Hartlepool about the Preston model. Now, we heard nothing of that during the election campaign. It was like, we don't really have any ideas. It's just we're not Jeremy Corbyn. And yet, the people who I know who were relatively close to Keir Starmer, for example, are part of the Fabian Society. And he seems to be that very Fabian socialism, which is a type of socialism I'm not really keen on at all. But it is a form of socialism. Why do you think that like a group of people who advocated that just came out with nothing like during that election?
It's really astonishing, right, to see. We've actually got this sort of weird, almost controlled scientific experiment where literally most of the country, nothing was being offered, literally nothing, right? If you look at their policy agenda, Keir Starmer came up with this idea of a national recovery bond, which is something we don't even need because, borrowing by the state is cheap, if not negative interest rates at the moment, and there's even like direct monetary financing going on from the Bank of England, so we didn't need it. And then he was going to throw some startup loans to small businesses, and that was it. And even Boris Johnson ridiculed them for having a sort of paltry agenda in the House of Commons. And the Tories are actually stealing our ideas and running with sort of watered down versions of elements of our program, whether it's the Green Industrial Revolution or an industrial strategy or things like the Towns Fund that is really aimed at at held back communities and so on. So it's a bit of a mystery, except that I think the real struggle that's going on at the moment is not a struggle for getting elected and for forming the next government. It's really a struggle for ownership and control of the Labour Party. And essentially, they are happy to crash and burn electorally, and will pay that price so long as they get to retake what they see as their party from what was essentially an insurgency, a massive influx of people that saw a different way of doing things under Jeremy Corbyn and felt the energy and the possibility there. And so that's the only way I can understand it, because if they were, even looking across the pond at what Biden is doing, leaving aside obviously the appalling foreign policy that continues and the role that the United States plays in empire and in the Middle East and so on. Even the sort of centrists of the third way, of which Biden himself was one, have recognized that times have changed and that this agenda of state interventionism, of increased public spending, is the one. And in fact, Johnson himself is talking in those terms. Now, they're not actually delivering, and it's not really going to benefit people on the ground in the way that it needs to. But why, in that context, would you run on basically nothing but flags and pints, and think that you can? It doesn't make sense to me, except that they're it's like the Khmer Rouge, right? Year zero. They have to wipe out all memory of everything that happened in the last 5 years so that they can sort of really reestablish control over the Labour Party as the second party of capital and as the B team that's waiting in the wings for when business gets sick of the Tories and wants to bring them back in. That's the only explanation I can come up with for why they're doing what they're doing, because it's not paying off electorally. Keir Starmer's less popular now than Jeremy Corbyn was, and he's had nothing like the assault that Corbyn had from the press and the establishment. He's made himself this unpopular on his own. So yeah, it's a bit mystifying unless you think about it in terms of a power struggle over ownership of the Labour Party.
Yeah, it's a real shame, isn't it? Because the only reason to be in the Labour Party and try to get elected, I suppose, is to help. The idea is you're trying to help, you're trying to improve lives, and if it's about something else, then what's really the point? And that brings me on to something we've talked about, like big scale things and medium scale things and smaller scale things. Now I'm at the smallest scale of local government. I'm a chair of a parish council, so I do have the authority. People always say that to me now, ever since Hanford. But I wondered, how can these kind of ideas be used where we've got a tiny budget? I'm in a village, tiny budget. How can we use these principles to try and improve things for the 3,000 people who live in my village?
Yeah, obviously you're going to be constrained by working with a small budget in a small context. But I think, again, the political education point is a really important one, right? So even if it's just looking at whatever portion of your discretionary funds are available and saying, why don't we talk to the community about what their real priorities are, and have a participatory budgeting process that allows people to join in and decide about how to allocate that, and then think about, how are you spending your money? Who are you contracting with? Is it possible to do it locally? If you're doing it locally, is it possible to say, well, are you paying the living wage to your employees, or are you respecting environmental sustainability? And so I think, no matter how small, there are wedges into really starting to open up this sort of new economic agenda. Obviously, be very happy to send you some stuff to read on that. myself and Martin O'Neill did a little book called The Case for Community Wealth Building back in 2019. And now Matthew Brown and Rhiann Jones have a book out on called Paint Your Town Red, which is about how Preston took back control, and your community can as well. And so there's sort of how-to guides are being developed. And then at the moment, we're actually working with Momentum and with some of the local leaders who've been at the kind of cutting edge of community wealth building to really develop toolkits, both for local office holders, but then also for local activists that really start to lay out how to get started. What are the questions to ask? You know, the first step is understand like what your economic footprint is. What are you already spending? Where is it going? Why is it going in that way? Start asking those questions, and then you can begin to develop an agenda that actually tries to repurpose that. I think, you know, some really simple things like creating spaces in community where people can come back together in a post-COVID context and be able to meet, or to have meeting spaces and so on. And I think so. You know, it may be that in the case of your parish council, it's not really about moving big chunks of the economy, but it's actually just about familiarizing people with these ideas and getting them to think about government and public spending as theirs and something that they get to have a say over and participate in. And that in itself is, I think, a powerful educational tool, because then you move up to, you know, to the next level, to the towns or the cities, or then to the region and so on. And you sort of scale it that way, I think.
It's really nice that you're saying that, because that was something I was looking into anyway, with participatory budgeting. And funnily enough, it's a real sad thing. I was part of County Durham lost a lot of Labour councillors and so on, and I was really trying to push Labour into running on a participatory budgeting system, getting people involved, because you know, that understanding for people, if they understand where the money's going, and you know, they would understand what's being cut as well, it would help people to understand absolutely everything, you know, like. And that's something I was really pushing for. Sadly, it didn't make it into the manifesto, and who knows what would have happened if it did. But that was something I thought we needed to go on and communicate better with communities. And, you know, maybe going forward, that's something they'll look into. You know, so it's a shame, really, that that's happened. So the last thing I'd like to say is, what are your hopes for the future, really? So what are your hopes for the future? And I'm going to slightly frame this in the context of the paper on the Democracy Collaborative on owning our future after COVID. So you've got something that's quite concrete there, haven't you? You've got a 5-point plan, is that right, for how things should build back after COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, you know, we did all this work around Corbynomics and around that sort of opening and opportunity. And then along comes COVID. And in many ways, it really deepens both the need, because it's exacerbating a lot of the societal tensions and the long running negative trends that we're dealing with on inequality and climate change and so on. And yet also it's really kind of torn back the curtain on the fact that actually the state is important and does have capacities and powers financially and in regulatory terms and so on, and that we do need to plan our economy to a much greater extent than we've been talking about. So we've sort of rolled out this 5-point plan that we're organizing our work around in sort of the immediate period of sort of COVID and post-COVID reconstruction. And the 5 points are as follows. The first is a kind of recognition that our local economies are going to be really hammered by the impacts of this pandemic, which is likely to have cascading effects going on into the future. We're at danger of, you know, of losing a lot of small and medium-sized businesses and seeing what might well be a big push to greater economic consolidation and concentration. So the danger is, as we've described it, an Amazon recovery. And to avoid that, we really want to figure out ways to sort of block the extraction of wealth from local economies and figure out ways to preserve local ownership. So we've been looking at state holding companies and an idea called the Local Economy Preservation Fund, which we've been pitching around the United States and in the UK context to a number of places, including Wales, actually, that would really be about trying to rescue distressed businesses that were totally viable pre-COVID, carry them through the crisis, and then exit by taking an ownership stake in them, right, holding them in partial or full public ownership, and then exiting them into local and worker and community ownership at the other end of that. So the first pillar is really about holding off further damage and really trying to keep what local economy we've got left that we can build upon. The second is really around public ownership and recognizing that there's a real need to advance public ownership in a number of sectors. I think, we got mocked for what was called broadband communism under Corbyn, but the need for high-speed quality internet and broadband connectivity has been really underscored by the pandemic. But not just that, also production of personal protective equipment or production of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. And so there's a role for the public sector to play in an industrial strategy to really stand up sectors of the economy that we thought it was fine to outsource and to send off to China. But actually, in this world in which we're living with climate change and all these other threats, we really got to work on bringing a lot of that back on shore and reestablishing it in our own economy, nationally and regionally and locally. Next, the third pillar is really, okay, how do we use this moment to really advance the community wealth building agenda and push the Preston model out there in response to the need to rebuild. We've seen what's happened in terms of the disinvestment in the local state and all the cuts that councils have been carrying. Now, as money becomes available for reconstruction, we ought to use it to build those local economies in the way that Preston is doing. We need a big Green New Deal and green industrial strategy, and that's the fourth pillar. And, as we bounce back from this crisis, how do we prepare our economy to meet the coming challenges of the future, not least of which is climate change? And then last but not least, we think this area of political education, training, of really building the movement and building the institutions that we need and the capacities that we need to develop leaders for the future and really allow working classes sort of leadership to emerge from communities, because the professionalization of politics has obviously been one of the big problems that we faced, and you see this with the Parliamentary Labour Party. So how do we actually encourage people that don't see themselves as politicians, but that actually understand the real challenges of communities, to come forward, to be educated, to have the confidence to speak out on all this agenda? And then how do we start to build the institutions, both in the labor movement, but also in a broader sort of socialist education sense that we need to create that sort of understanding and that leadership for the future? So that's our 5-point plan that we're orienting around for the next little while.
And who says the left doesn't have any concrete ideas? That sounds extremely well thought out. And what kind, if people stood on that political platform, I have every belief that would be incredibly popular with the public. So let's hope it's really, really successful, and let's hope that this is the way we build, because that the big worry is, of course, as you mentioned, it is like the Amazonization, as you said, those big corporations, and we've seen the wealth of billionaires going rocketing during this crisis. Which actually, I'll just do one final question, because I'm really keen on your opinion on this. For a little while now, I've been thinking that this could be the biggest demonstration that we've ever had that government investments or public funds actually end up in the hands of the wealthy. So if you increase the amount of public funds that you're putting into the economy, it's this trickle up idea, not trickle down as they try to claim. Do you think this is a huge demonstration of that? The fact that people over the last year, the billionaires, have increased their wealth so massively?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's happened, right, is through quantitative easing and other measures like that, we've essentially been pumping money into maintaining asset values, which is something that benefits the already existing wealthy. Then we've looked at, we've had this sort of major set of interventions, and yet, it's the capitalists, it's the landlord class, etc., who have been made whole. And we've done all right. We've had furlough, but that's only 80%, etc., etc. And so, really, the sort of the distribution of the interventions is something that's really important to look at, because who has been taken care of and who is actually continuing and will continue to bear the costs of this pandemic, I think is really important to clarify in people's minds, and really needs to be part of the conversation going forward. We've also seen, of course, this is maybe the flip side to what you're talking about, what we really need to get by as a society and as a community. It turns out that the essential workers are actually the people whose labor we've been undervaluing and calling unskilled. It's the caring professions, it's the transport professions, it's retail, it's keeping the supermarket shelves stacked and open, and not the hedge fund managers and the speculators and so on that we actually need to get by. And so I think there is an opportunity, and hopefully we haven't missed it, to really kind of talk about the real economy versus the financial economy, because there was some weird things happening at certain moments in the pandemic. You saw unemployment numbers come out in the United States, and the stock market shot up. And what that was capital saying, oh, we're laying off all this labor, so returns are going to be better for us. And so you kind of got a really stark sort of visualization of the sort of increasing gap between what we're told is the economy, GDP, stock market, et cetera, and then what's actually happening on the ground in the real economy. And that's where we've got to be, and that's where the struggle is, and that's where we've got to educate people, and that's what we actually need to provide for our families and for our communities, and to build the better world that we all want to see. So loads of work to be done there, but I think you're absolutely spot on. At the moment, this is a recovery for the few, and what we actually need is an economy for the many.
What a message to end on. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Thank you for providing us with these really good ideas and really good resources, and showing us that collaborative way that we can do things, and we can really make a difference in our communities. So thank you again.
Brilliant to talk to you, Paul.
We'll keep the red flag flying here.